in any kind of armed conflict, you're going to have a series of actions and reactions, or blows and counterblows. As either side actually goes through and starts putting their plans into action, the other side is going to react to that. And in this case, you're going to see the British reacting to what the Americans are doing, to what the French are doing, and vice versa. It's going to be one of ongoing change. You don't really go into a war with one plan and stick with that the whole way. That's a sure guarantee for defeat. You have to be able to adapt. And the Revolution was no different. You had blows and counterblows. Now, French reinforcements arrived. They were commanded by the Comte de Rochambeau. They arrived in Newport, Rhode Island in 1780. Now, these reinforcements were a true benefit to the colonials. The Continental Army needed the help. However, it would be a mistake to think that the French and the Americans were going to get along perfectly, that there would never be any kind of question, problem, or anything like that. In fact, sometimes you did have problems flare up between both the Americans and the French. Some were the Americans' fault, some were the French fault, and some just happened. So you can't go into this thinking that once the French arrived, everybody was just going to link arms, they'd all be happy, and there would never be another problem as we marched on against the English. There were going to be some, problems here and there. Now, one of these problems came in 1780. Feeling that he was unappreciated and lured by the promise of British gold and a command, General Benedict Arnold turned traitor at this point in time. He plotted with the British to basically give up West Point. Now, today that's where the U.S. Military Academy is located. Then it was a point on the Hudson River that pretty much, if we lost West Point, it was going to be very difficult to hold huge swaths of New York and probably would cost us the war. Now, the good news about this is that the plot was discovered. British Major Andre was captured with the plans to West Point. He was in civilian gear. He was not in uniform and was hanged as a result of being captured as a spy. Benedict Arnold fled with the British at that point in time. He escaped. He would eventually go on to actually command British troops in America. But it was this initial betrayal to which George Washington is reported to have cried out in anguish, "Whom can we trust now?" This was a major psychological blow to the Continental Army. Remember, Benedict Arnold had almost died in the Battle of Quebec. Had he died there from his wounds, he would have gone down in history and we would have celebrated him to this day as an American hero. Instead, he betrays the cause to the British. He ends up with a command, doesn't work out too well for him. He eventually dies in debt and unloved in England. He pretty much dies penniless and alone. He had thought he was unappreciated, and perhaps he had cause to think that. But at the same time, he had this belief in himself that no matter what he did was right. And he suffered the consequences of that, both then and now throughout all of history. There is, generally speaking, no greater an accusation that can be made accusing someone of traitorous activities than to call them a Benedict. Now, the British, as I said, had to adapt. Okay, they had their plans for fighting the war, the Continentals had their plans for fighting the war, and once contact was made with the enemy, all those plans began to change because you saw what both sides were capable of, how both sides were fighting, and therefore you had to reorient yourself to try to make sure that you had a better chance of success. So the British came up with the plan to roll up the colonies starting from the south and moving north. And so it was between 1778 and 1779, Georgia was ruthlessly overrun. They put a great number of British troops in the field in Georgia, trying to make sure that they had overwhelming superiority in numbers. From there, once Georgia had been secured, essentially as a base of operations, okay, you can think about the British landing troops on the coast. They would then fan out. Once they felt that Georgia was secure, they would start marching north. And it was in 1780, after they had gotten into South Carolina, that Charleston, or it used to be Charlestown, fell to the British. At this point, they took a large number of Continental troops and quite literally had the ability at that point, they could have kept marching north and won the war. However, the colonists during the French and Indian War had understood using guerrilla warfare tactics. The Continentals had learned this at Lexington and Concord, and so we're going to start fighting a partisan war. It is in the Carolinas that patriots fought very bitterly against their loyalist neighbors. Remember, I said previously that the Revolution was in effect a civil war within the United States. Not everyone was on the side of the patriots. There were those loyal to the crown. And those neighbors fought against one another. The idea was to tie up the troops as best they could in the South, trying to buy time for the French to arrive, and hope that they would be able to link up eventually with the armies from the North. We were not doing so well. Okay, the British had been marching north. We were trying to hold them up in South Carolina, for example, but the goal was to keep going into North Carolina and then eventually into Virginia. And it was in 1781 that American riflemen wiped out a British detachment at a place called Kings Mountain. And then there was another force that got defeated at a place called Cowpens. Now, both of these were beneficial in a number of ways. Now, this wasn't some kind of large-scale, thousands upon thousands of troops fell or were captured and things like that. But these were turning points, if nothing else, psychologically. Back during the French and Indian War, colonists had seen that Britain was not invincible. Now the Continentals understood that. And as they started to see some little breaks here and there, they would build on those to keep building up their forces. The Carolina Campaign of 1781. You have a Quaker-reared tactician, General Nathaniel Greene, distinguished himself with strategies of delay. Now, if you have a smaller force and you cannot meet a larger force head on, sometimes all you can hope for is to fight what's known as a holding action. You can keep stinging at the larger force, hoping that those little things here and there, those little stings, will be able to slow the enemy down, that they will have to stop and take greater time as they're moving along. Now, we have on here, it says Quaker-reared tactician. Quakers were, by their philosophy, pacifists. So you generally don't see a lot of Quaker generals. But in this case, Nathaniel Greene really worked that concept, that strategy of fighting a delaying action to the hilt. He worked very well at this. By slowly retreating and losing battles, okay, it's important to know that more often than not, the Continentals were losing the battles, but they were winning the campaigns. Okay, they were able to help clear the British out of Georgia and South Carolina. So you're not seeing a great deal of change coming in the concept of you have like a particular general ride in on a white horse and able to rally the troops and they can go off and crush the British. But instead, they're fighting with what actions they can use. They're using the tactics that they're finding are going to work. There's an old saying that says, no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. And that's going to be very true here. Once the battles had begun, it was not going to be the set piece battle that they had thought beforehand. It was going to require the ability to change and to adapt.